really glad to see this. But whether he's going to be the one who ends up in Formula One or not, that's another question.
The ultimate question, perhaps. All right, then. Well, those are sort of the kind of the teams we expect to be at the top. But then there's this huge midfield battle, it looks like, where, there's been quiet and confident sounds, Lewis, coming out from AlphaTauri. Alpine look like they've made a bit of a breakthrough in the last couple of days in Bahrain. Still a bit unsure about Aston Martin. No one can really quite place where they are. And Alfa Romeo, better, but again, a little bit of a mystery around there. How are you sort of marking out this midfield battle?
It's definitely the most difficult to try and formulate any kind of order is pretty much impossible beyond sort of maybe the top 4 teams. It's got this gaggle of teams that could really end up anywhere. I think it looks like it's going to be even more competitive, which seems hard to believe given how competitive the midfield fight has already been over the last couple of years. But I really think it could sort of change on a race-by-race basis as the season develops, as teams get on top of their cars and find extra pace. And yeah, it could shift. Not the teams that do well might not necessarily end up remaining in that position as the season goes on. But yeah, hard to read from a few of the teams. Aston Martin had a very solid but unspectacular couple of tests. It's under the radar is probably the best way to sort of describe them. Alfa Romeo struggled in the first test, had loads of technical issues and limited running, but got on top of those to a certain extent in Bahrain and were able to clock up a lot more mileage for both drivers, which was a positive for them. And they also featured, obviously the times are fairly meaningless, but you can't read too much into them, but they were, there or thereabouts, showing a bit of pace as well in the second test. But reliability seems to be their biggest concern. Valtteri Bottas admitted that he's talking very positively about the car itself, but he said his biggest concern at the moment is actually completing a race distance, which is obviously not the best sort of a worry for them going into the first race, certainly with all the issues they've had. But yeah, in general, it looks like it's going to be a very congested midfield. Hard to pick out who is going to be at the front of that. I mean, at the front, probably McLaren, but behind McLaren, it's very hard to try and.
In some ways, it's hard to say who's going to be last, isn't it? But I'm wondering also is I don't know what you think, Lewis, but some of those teams have a bit more disparity, if you like, between drivers' experience, knowledge, and potential pace. So you might actually end up with a real mix of cars at the bottom end of the grid, because you may have Valtteri, who we know can do one lap specials. He might do that in an Alfa Romeo, whereas Guan Yu Zhou might struggle to do that. He's learning F1. He's got so much to take on board. And I wonder that with some of the other teams at that level too, that there may be a bit more variation almost between the different drivers. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a similar story at AlphaTauri as well with Pierre. We've seen him put in some fantastic qualifying performances and race day performances. And there's obviously a bit more pressure on Yuki this year in his second season. He needs to step up and deliver those kind of performances. He ended the season quite strongly. But again, he needs to be up there matching Pierre. And like you say, the teammates are going to have a huge role to play in the final outcome of the championship standings for the midfield teams. And that could be a decisive factor. Haas also were particularly surprising in the second test with Kevin Magnussen and Mick Schumacher popping in a couple of fast laps on the last 2 days as well, showing that they seem to have a bit of extra pace this year. And the Haas seem to have made a step forward. So there's promising signs there. I don't think you could rule them out from being right in the midfield mix this season.
Well, it looks like based on their times, they're going to lock out the front row come qualifying. But
I think they had a bit less fuel than all the other teams.
Yes. Cooler conditions on their own and the track as well.
On their own.
Yeah. Interesting point, though, Ben, you bring up about the driver disparities as well, because as well as there being general pressure from getting on top of these regulations, there's pressure from within teams from certain high-ranking drivers. Alpine, Fernando Alonso, this is what he came back to Formula One for. If it doesn't work with Alpine, surely he's not going to stick around and waste his time in the mid to the lower pack.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you on that. I mean, he's throwing himself into it as ever at this early stage. And again, Alpine's one that's very hard to read. They had a bit of a tough time in Barcelona. It was definitely better in Bahrain, and he put together some quite good laps at the end of that test in Bahrain. But we don't really know quite where they are. There's been quite a lot of changes in management there at the team as well. Now, sometimes that's fine because actually the engineering side has stayed fairly consistent there. Whereas at Aston Martin, there are some quite big changes going on the engineering side. So that could change the car more. But I still wonder a little bit about, Alpine, the way it's been sort of restructured at the top end, whether that's going to have a little bit of an effect and how they're going to deliver. You still got two good drivers there, though. I mean, Fernando Alonso, brilliant double world champion, and Ocon, who I think really picked up the game again last year. He had struggled initially when he came back into Formula One, but did deliver, and they do seem to work together pretty well. So I think the fact that they might actually combine efforts and try and push Alpine up the ladder could help them.
I think Alonso really needs to see a significant step forward, though, from Alpine this year. He accepted that last year was going to be a bit of a, getting back into it, getting up to speed. He knew that everything was on 2022, so there's a lot of pressure on Alpine to perform, and yeah, if that doesn't happen, I can't see the desire or the hunger to continue for Fernando. He's obviously out of contract at the end of this season, so it's a big year for Alpine and Fernando.
Similarly on that, actually, Lewis, I suppose if we then switch over to Aston Martin again, they've got a new team principal, Mike Crack, at the helm, but also Sebastian Vettel. Comments coming out from the team that they've got to perform better to convince him to why he should stay, because so far that switch, hasn't proved completely successful. Again, it's another one where Vettel is focusing, on the regulation change. So that's another, a 4-time world champion in their team. They've got huge investment, huge backing now. So there's not a huge amount of excuse, I suppose, from Vettel's side.
Yeah, that's right. It's a very similar situation to Alpine in many respects. And yeah, a big year for Aston Martin. Obviously, they had difficulties last season with the rule changes to the floor impacting them quite severely, like with Mercedes too, and that really sort of ruined last season for them. So with a clean slate of the rules, hopefully they will be more competitive this season, because they'll need it for Vettel to have any interest in continuing. He's not, like you say, with Fernando and Sebastian, neither of them are there to be fighting in the mid to lower end of the grid, and with his contract running out too, that he needs to see some results to have that desire to stay on. Otherwise it could be his last season in F1. I think if those results don't come, potentially.
Wow, big call there from Lewis. There we go. We'll see if that one comes to fruition. But it was Vettel, Raikkonen, and Alonso were all fighting over P14 or whatever it was last year at one point, but also fighting for the most amount of overtakes. Wasn't that the going on into the 300s or whatever it was? And it was nothing between them all. But I don't think that's the title they really want to be fighting over, is it, at all? Quickly, I suppose, just before we come on to looking ahead to Bahrain as well. It is worth mentioning, I think, a bit more about Haas, Ben, isn't it? Because it's been a bit of a turbulent time for them, not just in the last few months, last couple of years. It's not been good for them. But this is what Gunther Steiner, the entire team, have been saying. You know what? We're focusing completely on this year. Again, we've sacrificed everything else. They've now got their driver lineup solidified. They say they've got the cash because they've obviously lost their Russian sponsor, Uralkali. They've got the cash. They've got a hell of an experienced driver in Kevin Magnussen, someone who knows the team, alongside a young gun, Mick Schumacher. Everyone wants them to do well, right? High hopes, or do you think it's going to be another languishing year?
Well, I mean, I think we've certainly been encouraged by what we've seen so far from them. Last year they did nothing to the car at all because they were putting all their money into this year's car, and so we had to put up with them being right down at the back. I think it's a fascinating year, and actually, as much as I understand, many people would have loved to have seen, for example, Oscar Piastri come into Formula One with an opportunity perhaps at Haas. I'm actually very happy to see Kevin Magnussen back because it will give us a bit of a relative performance with Mick Schumacher, which I think is important. I think Mick has shown well, and he's now got to take that next step. And we've often seen that in his second year in Formula 3 or Formula 2. He's often really shone in his second year. But we've got someone we can really compare him with directly. Kevin Magnussen is very consistent, very solid. I think they'll develop a good relationship. He finished fifth here in Bahrain back in 2018 with Haas. So, it has been a good track for him in the past. Haas were a much more competitive team at one stage. They've never had a podium, but they only just missed out a few times. They had a couple of fourth places over the years. Can they get back to that really strong midfield level? That's really what we want to see. And I do think there's a chance for that.
Well, I think it will be something that everybody wants to see, isn't it? And speaking of Bahrain, Ben, I suppose let's get into it. You've been there several times, of course. You've commentated on many, many races from Bahrain. Give us a little guide to what we can expect this weekend. The track, the weather, the layout. What's it all like from your perspective? Any tips and tricks you've got for us?
It's actually a nice venue to go to, I have to say. The paddock area is one of the best for bumping into people and saying hello. Now that we're allowed to do that again, people can wander around a bit more freely. It makes life a lot easier, and it's a good venue. I mean, the track surface, as we've seen, is quite abrasive, quite bumpy. The wind is also crucial, and I have heard actually that the forecast for this weekend is for quite a lot of wind around again. That has quite a big effect there. And it's not just the fact that now we've got ground effect performance cars. They're very sensitive to wind, as Formula One cars always are. But you can get some of the dust and sand blown onto the circuit as well, if the wind gets strong enough. So that can have an effect on a lap. Suddenly you're arriving somewhere where there's a bit of sand that's just been blown onto the track, and suddenly you have a bit of a slide. So it'll make it interesting. And I do quite like the layout. I mean, I think what we do need to see, and we'll find out, is whether these new rules about the cars being able to follow each other more closely does work in Bahrain. Because in the past, you've needed a huge delta in terms of your speed, really, to be able to overtake the guy in front. And we have seen some overtakes there, but not huge a number of overtaking. I'm hoping that with these new format cars, that we really will see a bit more overtaking around the track.
Yeah, just to sort of jump in on that point. I mean, the early comments from the drivers have been very positive about following and the hope for better racing, which is obviously the main intention of these new cars. The comments have been positive. The drivers saying that following is easier, not necessarily overtaking. I remember George Russell saying in Barcelona, highlighting issues with the effect of the slipstream potentially not being as effective as it used to be. He was running closely behind Lando and was able to do so for multiple laps, but couldn't actually get close enough to pull out and make a move. But then in Bahrain, we saw a bit of racing action across all 3 days, actually. And that's very positive. That's a positive sign for the season ahead, because we saw a few different drivers racing each other wheel to wheel throughout multiple corners. And on the final day, we had Pierre Gasly and Lewis Hamilton scrapping it out for multiple laps. It lasted really for quite a long time, actually, which is really encouraging to see that they were able to follow each other for such a long time, so closely, and pull off overtakes on each other. So hopefully we will see improvements, because it certainly seems like that will be the case.
On the technical side of it, I suppose, Lewis, actually, it's probably worth saying that because big regulation overhaul. I think everybody was talking about that constantly throughout this first weekend, especially. But with such a big overhaul, there's lots of things that are left up to interpretation and lots of ways that teams are going to try and get around various things. And what we've seen come up in the last couple of days, which I'm sure will be a talking point coming into this weekend as well, is these new mirrors that especially Mercedes debuted this weekend that sort of form part of the side impact structure. So they're kind of mirrors, but they're also fins. So, and the rule is that as long as they classified as bodywork, but they're not supposed to help in aerodynamics or anything like that. What can you sort of tell us, and what have you gleaned from that side of things? Is this going to be a big mirror war? Are we going to see this clamp down on? How's it looking from your end?
Yeah, I mean, the season's not even started, and we're already talking about potentially a legality war going on. And yeah, the mirrors are an element that the teams have taken issue with. Ferrari team principal Matteo Binotto questioned the mirrors, calling them spaceships on Mercedes, and sort of highlighted concerns with that, because the teams agreed previously to not look to exploit aerodynamic performance through mirror designs. Their purpose is to be on the car to look behind you, not to gain lap time performance out of. So yeah, definitely an area that could be a big talking point, and one that the teams will be debating about and going into the new season for sure. But it's in general, it's been fascinating to see all the different aerodynamic concepts and approaches that the teams have taken. There was a bit of a worry going into the season that the cars would all look the same, but we've actually seen a lot of different approaches particularly with the front wings and the side pods. There's a lot of scope for different variations there. And it'll be interesting to see whether one particular approach works the best and whether the other way doesn't at all and it's a disaster, or whether actually the performance can be found using both types of concepts. So yeah, that'll be another one to keep an eye on as the season goes on, and it would be really fascinating to see how that works out.
Well, look, we're getting towards the end and it is race week, so it's only a few days away till we see all of this action unfold on track and we get some kind of idea of what a pecking order is. But I'm afraid, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you for your podium predictions, please. Your winner and your P2 and P3. And we'll do this every week, and there'll be a running leaderboard, and whoever gets the most amount of points by the end of the year wins my congratulations. So who wants to go first? Ben, have you got any ideas?
Well, I it's pure guesswork. I'm going to go for Max taking the win.
Right.
Charles Leclerc in second, and Lewis in third. Yeah, that's what I'm going to go for.
Oh, okay. All right. All the big hitters are up there, though. Go on, Lewis. What are you thinking?
Very similar. Again, complete guessing here. No one knows. But I'm going to go with Max for the win, Lewis P2, and Charles completing the podium in third.
Okay. All right, then. So you've got big faith in Charles. So I think we've all gone for a Verstappen win. I'm putting my money on Verstappen. I've gone for Sainz P2. I like the look of Carlos this year, really do. And then I put Hamilton P3. So we're all fairly similar. A couple of differences. So we'll see this time
we'll
next
all
week.
Be wrong, you know that. We'll all be
exactly.
Wrong.
We'll all be wrong, and it will be a Kevin Magnussen win with Albon second, won't it? So wouldn't that be a turn up? That would be amazing, wouldn't it? Well, look,
what a start to the season that would be.
It really would be. Well, look, we will be back next week to have a look back, and we'll actually know and have some things to talk about properly. But thank you so much, gents, for joining me on this first Crash F1 podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you both alongside. And thank you for listening or watching wherever you may be doing that as well. Make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. And if you've got any questions as well that you want us to answer, do send them in on anything and everything. Leave them in the comments section on the Crash F1 YouTube channel, or get them through to the Crash F1 social media. And make sure you do like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. I'll be saying that a lot over the course of this season. But from myself, Harry Benjamin, from Ben Edwards and Lewis Larkam, we will see you same time next week. Bye-bye.